He thought a gun would scare the ranch hand, but the moment my U.S. Marshal badge came out, the entire HOA security team froze. The evening had settled soft and golden across the ranch, the kind of light that made the wooden fence posts glow like embers and stretched long shadows across the open pasture. The faint hum of cicadas buzzed beneath the quiet rustle of wind in the tall grass. It should have been peaceful. End of day, chores winding down, the scent of hay still hanging in the air. But peace shattered in an instant. From the direction of the front gate came shouting, loud, harsh, cutting straight through the evening calm. The voice was sharp, brimming with authority it didn't deserve, and it made Elias freeze where he stood. Elias, my ranch hand, was a man of few words. His work spoke for him. Steady hands, quiet loyalty, the kind of presence you didn't notice until you realized how much you relied on him. Now his back stiffened, his hands half raised, his dark eyes locked on the figure standing opposite him. A man in a cheap black uniform, a shiny badge stitched crookedly to his chest, had a pistol drawn. He held it with both hands, pointing it squarely at Elias's torso. His voice barked commands, the barrel twitching with every syllable. You don't belong here. Step back. Step away from a gate. Elias's voice, steady but low, replied, I work here, sir. This is the ranch. My boss is inside. His accent carried the weight of someone who had spent years working with his hands, someone not used to defending himself with words. The man sneered, his lips curling, his finger brushing too close to the trigger. His stance screamed adrenaline and arrogance, not training. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, pretending to be calm, but betraying his nerves in every twitch. Don't lie to me. I've had complaints about men like you hanging around. You're trespassing, and I don't tolerate trespassers. From where I stood in the barn, I had heard every word. My hand instinctively stilled on the shovel I had been using. A slow breath filled my chest, and I stepped forward, boots crunching on gravel, my eyes locked on the scene unfolding like a nightmare at my own gate. The guard's head whipped toward me, his face tightening with irritation at being interrupted. For a split second, he didn't lower his gun. Instead, he shifted the barrel slightly, as if to make me part of the problem. His arrogance was palpable. Stay back, he barked, his voice higher now, betraying the crack in his false authority. This doesn't concern you. I've got orders from the HOA to deal with this intruder. Don't interfere. I walked closer, not fast, not slow, just steady. My belt caught the fading light, and I noticed his gaze flickered downward, though his pride forced his chin higher. My eyes didn't leave his. That man, I said, my tone calm, almost too calm for the moment, is no intruder. He works for me, on my land. The guard scoffed, though his grip on the weapon faltered for a second. Your land? He repeated, a mocking lilt in his voice. Everything behind this gate is governed by the association. Rules are rules. Outsiders don't get special treatment. He doesn't belong here. Elias stood motionless, his chest rising and falling, sweat shining faintly on his brow. His hands were raised just enough to show compliance, but his eyes flickered to me, waiting, trusting. I took another step forward, close enough now to see the tremor in the guard's wrist. His bravado was slipping, but his pride held him fast. He needed to feel powerful. That was the danger, an armed man who believed he had something to prove. My hand shifted slightly at my waist, where the weight of the badge rested, half concealed beneath my jacket. I hadn't planned to reveal it tonight. I had hoped my work and my life here would remain separate, that this place could be a sanctuary from the world I carried with me. But this man, this self-declared soldier of the HOA, had forced my hand. He sneered again, raising his voice louder, perhaps hoping his authority would echo enough to cover his uncertainty. Step back right now, or I'll make you regret it. Both of you. The HOA doesn't tolerate defiance. You think you're safe out here, but I'll show you. His words broke off the second my jacket shifted, the silver glint of the badge catching what remained of the evening light. His eyes froze, narrowing, and then widening as recognition dawned. The air between us seemed to thicken. Elias lowered his hands slightly, still tense but sensing the shift in control. The guard's voice faltered, no longer booming, now stammering. "W8 is that?" "It is," I interrupted, my voice low, controlled. I took another step closer, my boots steady, my eyes fixed on his trembling weapon. "I'm a U.S. Marshal, and you just committed a crime by pointing that gun at an unarmed man working lawfully on my property." His face lost its sneer. Panic flickered across his features, but pride clawed to hold on. I was just following orders. "The HOA president," he said. "Does the HOA issue federal authority now?" I asked, cutting him off. My tone sharpened, not with volume, but with certainty, the kind of voice that left no room for argument. He swallowed hard. The pistol lowered an inch, then another. His stance crumbled, all the artificial bravado bleeding away, leaving only a nervous man with shaking hands. Elias exhaled for the first time in what felt like minutes, his shoulders sagging slightly, though his eyes never left the weapon. I moved closer, slow and deliberate, until I was standing just a few feet away. My hand hovered near the badge, letting it catch the light again, letting its weight do what words could not. "Put the weapon down," I said quietly. "Now." The guard's arm finally dropped, the pistol falling to his side, his chest heaving with uneven breaths. He looked at me like a cornered animal, his eyes darting to the gate, to the road beyond, searching for escape. But there was no escape. Not from me. Not from what he had done. I studied him for a long moment, memorizing every detail. The patch on his sleeve, the nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth, the sweat rolling down his temple. This wasn't just about him. No, this was bigger. This was about the man who had given the order, the one who had turned this neighborhood into his personal kingdom. Richard, the HOA president. The man who had unleashed this so-called security force on decent men just trying to live in peace. And in that moment, standing in the fading light with Elias at my side and a trembling gunman before me, I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't an isolated mistake. This was the crack in the armor, the first thread to pull. Richard thought he was untouchable, but he had just made the single worst mistake of his life. I let the silence hang for a moment longer, the air heavy with consequence. The guard swallowed, lowering his eyes, mumbling, "I didn't mean. I wasn't gonna." But the words were empty. The deed was done, and in my mind, the decision had already been made. This wasn't about defending Elias anymore. This was about dismantling the entire rotten empire that called itself an HOA. And Richard had no idea what was coming for him. The next morning, the ranch woke with the sound of roosters crowing, the smell of dew-soaked earth, and the steady rhythm of Elias tending to the livestock. But while the day began like any other, the unease from the night before still lingered in my chest. The image of the trembling guard with his gun raised was fresh in my mind. A man doesn't just act that recklessly without permission, or without someone pulling strings behind him. And I knew exactly who that someone was. Richard. Around town, folks called him the Karen of the cul-de-sac, though no one dared say it within earshot of his polished shoes or smug grin. He had been HOA president for 3 years, and in those years, he had turned what should have been a simple community association into his own personal kingdom. He thrived on control. If you drove through the neighborhood, you could spot his influence instantly. Every lawn clipped to the same height, every mailbox painted the same dull color, every driveway regulated down to the angle of the parked cars. It wasn't pride in the neighborhood that drove him. It was power. I still remembered the first time I saw him in action. It was 6 months ago at a community barbecue. A retired veteran named Mr. Callahan had set up a small flagpole in his front yard. Nothing gaudy, just a simple American flag waving in the breeze. Richard strutted across the grass in his pressed khakis and spotless loafers, carrying a clipboard like it was a royal decree. His voice cut through the laughter of the gathering. "This flag must come down," Richard had announced, his finger stabbing toward the pole as though it were a crime scene marker. "It clashes with the neighborhood aesthetic." Page 14, subsection C of the bylaws. Decorative installations must be approved in advance. Mr. Callahan, a man who had served 30 years in the military, stood tall, his jaw tight. "That flag's been with me longer than you've been alive, son. It's not coming down." Richard's smile was the kind that didn't reach his eyes. Then expect fines. Daily fines. The HOA doesn't make exceptions. The crowd had gone silent. Even back then, I felt the chill of his arrogance. It wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about breaking men down, showing them they weren't as free as they thought. That was Richard's game, and he played it well. Neighbors whispered about his letters, the ones that arrived like clockwork. A truck parked the wrong way on the street? $100 fine. Grass an inch too tall? $50 per day until corrected. A kid's basketball hoop left by the curb overnight? Another fine. The letters always ended with the same smug line. Failure to comply will result in legal action and property seizure. He had even installed cameras at the entrance of the community, not for safety, but for spying. More than once, Elias told me he noticed the cameras panning slowly whenever he walked by, as if Richard himself were behind the lens, waiting for a chance to pounce. But Richard's most recent stunt had been the most dangerous yet, his so-called security team. Men like the one who drew a gun on Elias were handpicked by Richard, given uniforms that looked official but were little more than stitched patches and black caps. They strutted through the neighborhood in pairs, jotting down infractions, rattling off rules, and intimidating anyone who dared push back. They weren't trained officers, but Richard encouraged them to act as though they were. And it wasn't just about intimidation anymore. Last night had proved that. As I mulled it over, Elias joined me by the fence, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. He spoke quietly, but his words carried weight. "Boss, that man wasn't acting alone. You could see it in his face. He thought he had protection." I nodded. He did. Richard gave him the order. And that means this isn't just about one man pulling a weapon. It's about the whole HOA. Elias spat in the dirt, his jaw clenched. Men like Richard don't stop until they're stopped. He was right. Later that afternoon, I drove into the neighborhood. I wanted to see Richard with my own eyes, not just as the puppet master pulling strings from behind closed doors, but as the man who thought he could wield power without consequence. Richard's house stood at the center of the cul-de-sac, larger than the rest, painted in pristine beige with manicured hedges lining the driveway. A black SUV sat parked out front, spotless, polished until it gleamed. Even his trash cans were perfectly aligned, as though any disorder would offend him personally. I parked down the street and watched as Richard stepped outside, clipboard in hand. He was inspecting a neighbor's driveway, crouching down to measure the distance between the sidewalk and the edge of a parked car. The owner of the car, a young father named David, came rushing out with his toddler in his arms. "Richard, come on," David said, his voice tired. "I've had a long week. My boy's sick. I just forgot to move the car back a foot. Can't you let us slide this once?" Richard straightened, smirking. "Rules are rules, David. You signed the bylaws when you moved in. If I let you slide, then what? Everyone parks wherever they want. Chaos. Disorder. No, you'll get the letter by tomorrow." The toddler whimpered, clinging to his father's neck. David's face flushed with quiet rage, but he said nothing. He just turned back toward the house, defeated. Richard scribbled on his clipboard, satisfied. That was the kind of man he was. As I watched, a neighbor approached me quietly from his porch. It was Mr. Jensen, a retired schoolteacher with a hunched back and kind eyes. He leaned on his cane and whispered, "You're new here, ain't you? Careful crossing Richard. He's ruined men for less." I turned toward him, my voice calm but steady. "He ruined his own man last night. Had one of his guards point a gun at Elias." Mr. Jensen's eyes widened, his knuckles tightening around the cane. "Then you've seen what he's capable of. He won't stop there. Not until he believes he's broken you." Those words settled over me like a storm cloud. I stayed a while longer, watching Richard strut from house to house, his smug grin growing with every complaint he scribbled, every neighbor he cowed into submission. He believed himself invincible, above the law, untouchable. He believed no one would ever dare stand up to him. But he was wrong. What Richard didn't know was that every arrogant move he made, every order he gave, every humiliation he dished out was another thread in the rope tightening around his own neck. And after what he had done to Elias, I wasn't just a bystander anymore. Richard thought he was the king of the cul-de-sac, but I was about to remind him that even kings could fall. Here's part 3 expanded into a full, immersive chapter. The first sign that Richard had no intention of backing down came the very next morning. The rancher, broad-shouldered, weathered from years of honest labor, stood at the edge of his property, watching a pair of men in ill-fitting uniforms march along the fence line. Their plastic badges gleamed under the morning sun, but their authority was nothing more than a show. Richard had christened them his security team. Yet to the rancher, they looked like actors in a cheap play, strutting about with clipboards and walkie-talkies as though the cul-de-sac were a military compound. One of them, a lanky fellow with nervous eyes, pointed at the cattle trough. Per HOA directive, water usage is being suspended until compliance is reviewed. His voice cracked, as though even he didn't believe what he was saying. The rancher's jaw tightened. He said nothing. He simply followed the movement of the man's finger toward the shutoff valve, already sealed with a chain and a bright red tag. The livestock shuffled restlessly behind him, sensing the tension. Cutting off water wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a deliberate strike at his livelihood. Orders from President Richard, the second guard muttered, as if that name alone carried authority. He avoided the rancher's stare, scribbling notes on his clipboard like a child pretending at work. The rancher didn't argue. He turned, boots crunching against the gravel, and walked back toward his house. Silence was his weapon now. Words could be twisted, emotions used against him. But silence. That was the beginning of a trap Richard couldn't see forming. Later that day, a letter slid under his door. The envelope bore the HOA's official seal, though the font looked suspiciously different from the usual print. Inside was a set of revised bylaws, pages filled with dense legal jargon. They claimed his land violated zoning ordinances, that livestock was not permitted under new community guidelines, and that sections of his acreage were now subject to HOA seizure. The rancher sat at his table, the paper spread before him like a declaration of war. His eyes lingered on Richard's signature at the bottom, bold and smug. The man didn't even bother to disguise his handwriting. He leaned back in his chair, staring out the window. The setting sun painted the fields gold, but all he felt was the weight of betrayal. This wasn't just a man enforcing rules. This was a tyrant bending law to his will. The rancher had weathered storms, droughts, and predators, but this was different. Richard wasn't coming for his grass or his fence. He was coming for control, for dominance over men he believed too weak to resist. That evening, Elias stopped by. The ranch hand's cheek was still bruised from Richard's earlier stunt, the faint outline of the gun incident lingering in his expression. He shifted uncomfortably, his hat in hand. "They're saying I'm trespassing now," Elias muttered, his voice low. Richard told the sheriff's office, "I broke into the subdivision." "Can you believe that?" The rancher studied him. And did the sheriff believe him? Elias hesitated, then shook his head. "Not fully, but Richard's got influence. He's been whispering in ears, making me out to be some kind of criminal. I can't even walk past the grocery without someone staring." His fists clenched around the brim of his hat. "I don't know how much longer I can take it." The rancher placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "You hold on. Don't give him the satisfaction. Every move he makes leaves a mark, and I've been keeping track." From a drawer, he pulled out a black notebook. Thick, heavy, its pages filled with dates, times, and careful notes. Alongside it lay a small camera and a stack of memory cards. "I've been filming Elias. Every letter, every meeting, every patrol of his so-called guards. He thinks he's clever, but he's sloppy. Lies always leave trails." For the first time that evening, Elias's tense features softened. There was hope in his eyes. "You're really going to take him down, aren't you?" The rancher's gaze hardened. "He's already taken himself down. I'm just giving him the rope." The next week brought escalation like wildfire. Richard plastered notices across the neighborhood bulletin board, labeling the rancher's property a hazard and Elias a known offender. He even claimed livestock waste threatened community health. But behind the theatrics, Richard's greed was beginning to show. The rancher noticed freshly paved sidewalks that no one requested, beautification projects that led to no real improvements, and invoices that didn't match the quality of work. Money was vanishing into Richard's pockets. One night, under cover of darkness, The rancher parked his truck near the HOA office, a converted garage at the edge of the cul-de-sac. He waited until the patrol of security drifted off, then stepped out quietly. The night was still, only the distant hum of crickets accompanying him. With practiced patience, he moved toward the office window, camera in hand. Through the glass, he saw Richard hunched over a desk, counting bills. Stacks of cash sat neatly in piles, alongside HOA receipts. The rancher zoomed the camera, recording every detail. Richard laughed to himself, raising a glass of whiskey as though toasting his own brilliance. Click. Another photo. Another piece of evidence. The noose tightened. But the rancher knew exposure required more than photos. He needed the neighbors, the very people Richard had been exploiting, to see the truth with their own eyes. And for that, patience was his greatest weapon. The following weekend, Richard gathered the community for what he called a special announcement. Folding chairs lined the cul-de-sac, a makeshift stage set up with a podium. His security team flanked him, their uniforms too tight, their eyes scanning as though expecting a riot. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice dripping with false charm, "we are facing a crisis. Certain individuals in this neighborhood are attempting to undermine order, to destroy the harmony we've all worked so hard to maintain." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The rancher stood near the back, arms crossed, silent. Richard's eyes flicked toward him, then back to the audience. "I've received complaints of illegal livestock activity, of trespassing by known offenders, and of disrespect toward the rules that keep our homes valuable. But rest assured, your HOA is taking decisive action. We will protect this community at any cost." The rancher noted every word, every lie. His phone recorded the entire speech, proof of Richard's paranoia and deceit. Then came a twist. Richard unveiled a new banner, bold letters spelling out Community Renewal Project. He claimed the HOA had raised tens of thousands for neighborhood improvements, yet no one had ever seen such money collected. A hand rose in the crowd. It was Mr. Alvarez, a retired schoolteacher known for his sharp memory. "Richard," he said slowly, "I never paid into this so-called fund. None of US did. Where's this money coming from?" Richard's smile faltered for the briefest second. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat. "Donations, grants, community outreach. You wouldn't understand the details." But the rancher saw it, the crack in the mask, and he knew the time was coming when that mask would shatter completely. That night, Elias returned with a discovery of his own. He had spoken with a contractor Richard hired for a paving job. Said Richard paid him half in cash, told him not to file any paperwork. The guy's nervous, but he might talk if pushed. The rancher's eyes lit with grim satisfaction. That's the missing piece. Paperwork trails vanish, but testimonies don't. He tucked the notebook under his arm, the weight of collected evidence pressing down like a silent promise. Richard thought he was playing chess, but the truth was simpler. Every move Richard made only narrowed his options, pushing him closer to checkmate. And as the rancher looked out over his land, the stars sharp against the night sky, he whispered to himself, "He thinks he's untouchable. But the higher he climbs, the harder he'll fall." The first page of the dossier looked ordinary, just a scanned copy of one of Richard's threatening letters, full of pompous words and bold print warnings. But to the rancher, that page was the first brick in a wall Richard could never climb over. He laid it flat on the dining table, the surface already covered with files, receipts, photographs, and sworn statements. Each piece was another nail in the coffin Richard had built for himself. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of weeks pressing against him. Sleep had come in short bursts lately, his mind constantly turning over strategies, remembering details, replaying every confrontation. But behind the weariness burned something stronger, resolve. Richard thought he had bullied a landowner into silence. What he didn't know was that the man he pushed was a U.S. Marshal. That badge, tucked quietly away in a drawer most days, wasn't for show. It came with access, databases, financial tracing tools, and connections that reached further than Richard's petty circle of influence. The rancher had never flaunted it, because he believed in solving problems as a man before leaning on authority. But Richard had crossed a line, and now the badge became the sharpest weapon in his arsenal. It started small. Every letter Richard sent was scanned, cataloged, and compared for inconsistencies. Font changed. Dates didn't match. The HOA seal sometimes appeared blurred, as if copied from a low-resolution image. Alone, these details meant little. Together, they revealed forgery. Then came the recordings. Each time Richard's self-appointed guards swaggered onto his property, the rancher kept the camera rolling. They didn't notice at first, too caught up in their mock authority. One video showed a guard trying to issue a fine for muddy tire tracks on a dirt road. Another captured them stepping over the property line, one even muttering, "He won't do anything about it." That sentence alone carried weight, proof of harassment with intent. At night, the rancher's living room transformed into an operations center. Papers lined the walls, maps marked with pins, timelines stretching across poster boards. Elias sometimes joined him, silent at first, then slowly opening up as the pieces came together. "You've got enough to bury him," Elias said one evening, his voice edged with awe as he flipped through a folder of receipts. "Not yet," the rancher replied firmly. His eyes didn't leave the papers spread before him. "Evidence is one thing. Timing is another. He's clever enough to wriggle out if I move too early. I need him trapped so deep, the truth crushes him before he realizes it's there." The real breakthrough came when the rancher tapped into his Marshal's resources. With quiet precision, he cross-referenced HOA financial records against federal banking data. What emerged was a trail Richard had thought invisible. Small transfers into shell accounts, inflated invoices from non-existent contractors, checks signed under aliases. Each pattern pointed back to him, but hidden among the numbers was something more disturbing. Some accounts weren't in Richard's name. They were tied to one of his security men, a neighbor named Paul who had been particularly aggressive. The rancher frowned at the discovery. Why would Richard funnel money into an underling's account? Was it hush money? Or was Paul more deeply entangled in this than anyone realized? The next day, the rancher watched Paul more closely. The man strutted around in his cheap uniform, sunglasses perched on his nose despite the cloudy sky. But there was a nervous twitch in his movements, a hesitation each time someone mentioned HOA funds. The rancher noted it silently. Pressure would make Paul crack eventually. Not every neighbor trusted the rancher at first. Some feared Richard too much to speak, others believed his lies. But gradually, as whispers spread about embezzled funds and fraudulent letters, men who had once stayed silent began to knock on the rancher's door. One evening, Mr. Alvarez arrived, his voice low but steady. "He fined me for a birdhouse," he confessed, anger simmering beneath his calm tone. Said it was an unauthorized structure, took the money, and claimed it went toward park benches. But I never saw a single bench put up. The rancher slid a form across the table. Sworn statement. Write it all down. Date, amount, his exact words. Alvarez's hand shook slightly as he wrote, but when he signed his name at the bottom, his eyes met the rancher's with newfound strength. "Whatever you're planning," he said, "you're not doing it alone anymore." Soon, the stack of testimonies grew. A mechanic fined for oil stains that weren't there. A veteran threatened over the height of his flagpole. A widower ordered to repaint his door 3 times because the shade of blue didn't align with community standards. Each account wasn't just paperwork. It was a voice reclaiming power. But Richard wasn't blind to the shifting tide. He felt it in the coolness of once friendly greetings, in the hesitation of neighbors who no longer laughed at his jokes. And so he grew more desperate. One night, as the rancher walked the fence line, he found the lock on his barn pried open. Inside, tools were scattered, feed bags slashed open, water spilled across the floor. No animals were harmed, but the message was clear: intimidation. Elias cursed under his breath when he saw the damage. This is getting dangerous. He's not just playing with fines anymore. The rancher's voice was calm, but his eyes were steel. That's what happens when men like him lose control. They lash out, but every outburst leaves another mark against him. He set a small hidden camera in the barn that night, angled toward the door. If Richard, or one of his men, returned, they'd be caught red-handed. Days later, the unexpected twist arrived. A thick envelope appeared in the rancher's mailbox, unmarked. Inside were photocopies of HOA invoices and bank statements. They confirmed what he had already suspected. Money was being siphoned. But what startled him was the source. The documents were detailed, too detailed to come from guesswork. Someone inside Richard's circle was leaking information. The rancher studied the papers for hours, piecing together connections. One signature stood out, Paul's again. He realized the man had been forced into complicity. Perhaps Richard had used him as a cover. Perhaps he had grown tired of being the fall guy. Either way, the cracks within Richard's empire were widening. The final push came one evening when the rancher spread the complete dossier across his table. Pages of evidence lay neatly in order. Letters, forged bylaws, recordings, testimonies, financial records, leaked invoices. He stared at it all, the silence of the room broken only by the ticking clock on the wall. Elias walked in, whistling low. Looks like a case file out of a courtroom. The rancher gave a faint smile. That's because it is. He tapped the thick folder. When this lands on the right desk, Richard won't just lose his title. He'll lose everything he built on lies. Elias leaned against the wall, studying him. You ever worry he'll figure out who you really are? That badge isn't exactly something you can hide forever. The rancher's expression darkened. If he does, it'll be too late for him to do anything about it. The trap's already set. All he has to do now is walk into it. That night, as the rancher stood by his window, watching the cul-de-sac in stillness, he felt the storm building. Richard's arrogance, his greed, his belief in his own invincibility. Every piece was converging toward the inevitable. The neighbors no longer whispered in fear. They whispered in anticipation. And in that moment, the rancher knew the game had shifted. Richard wasn't the hunter anymore. He was prey. The trap was set, and Richard, in all his arrogance, was walking straight into it. The room smelled faintly of coffee and carpet cleaner, a strange mix that clung to the community center where the HOA held its monthly meetings. Folding chairs were lined in neat rows, filled with men who carried the same weary look they always did, tired of Richard's rules, tired of his fines, tired of feeling like prisoners in their own homes. Still, most came because not attending meant more trouble. That was how Richard kept his grip, through fear and routine. But tonight, something was different. The air itself seemed heavy, charged, like the silence before a thunderstorm. The rancher could feel it in his bones as he carried a thick leather folder under his arm. Elias walked in with him, steady as a shadow, his expression unreadable. Eyes followed them as they took seats near the front. A murmur rippled across the room. Then the door banged open. Richard strode in, chest puffed, chin high, his cheap cologne arriving before him. He wore his arrogance like armor, dressed in a tailored suit a little too tight around the waist. Behind him trailed two of his self-appointed security officers, uniforms pressed, eyes scanning the room as though this were some kind of battlefield. Richard's smirk stretched as he looked over the crowd. "Well, gentlemen," he began, his voice dripping with false charm. "Another month, another set of improvements to keep our community the most desirable in the county. Let's get started." He hadn't noticed the folder yet. He hadn't seen the calm resolve in the rancher's eyes. The rancher let him go on for a few minutes, boasting about upcoming projects that didn't exist, threatening new fines for minor violations, and congratulating himself on his leadership. Then, with deliberate calm, the rancher stood. The scrape of his chair against the floor drew every eye in the room. He placed the thick folder on the table at the front, right in front of Richard. "I think," the rancher said evenly, "it's time we talked about the truth." Richard froze, his smirk flickering for just a moment before he recovered. He chuckled, trying to play it off. "Truth? I don't know what you think you've got there, but—" The rancher opened the folder and slid out the first set of documents. The sound of paper hitting wood echoed in the silent room. "This," the rancher continued, "is video footage. Footage of one of your guards drawing a weapon on my ranch hand. On my property. Without cause. That's assault with a deadly weapon." He placed a USB drive on top of the papers. Several men in the back leaned forward, whispering. Richard's smirk wavered again. The rancher pulled out another stack, bank statements, crisp and undeniable. And these are records of HOA funds, money that was supposed to go toward repairs, landscaping, new equipment. Instead, it went into accounts tied directly to you and your men. Thousands of dollars. Richard's face flushed red. Those are lies, fabricated, he barked, his voice cracking slightly. Really? The rancher's voice stayed calm, steady, the kind of tone that cut sharper than any shout. He laid down sworn statements next. Because these are testimonies from your neighbors. Signed, dated, sworn under penalty of perjury. They say you fined them for things that never existed. You took their money, Richard, and I can prove where it went. The room had gone deathly still. Men who once sat with arms crossed now leaned forward, eyes wide. Some clenched their fists. Others nodded, murmuring agreement. Richard's hands twitched as he reached for the papers, trying to snatch them away. But before he could, the rancher placed something else on the table, his badge. The silver gleam caught the overhead lights, flashing like a blade. The room collectively inhaled. The security guards shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. Richard stumbled back a step, his voice thin. You're bluffing. The rancher's eyes locked on his, unflinching. No, Richard, I'm a U.S. Marshal, and I don't bluff. For a long second, nobody moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner. Then Richard tried again, his voice louder but desperate now. This is all fake. You people know me. I've led this HOA for years. Don't listen to him. He spun toward the crowd, his arms spread wide, searching for support. But the crowd didn't nod. They didn't cheer. Instead, they whispered to one another, faces dark with anger. One man stood, then another. You fined me for a garden shed, one said bitterly. You stole from all of us, another growled. You pointed guns at our neighbors, someone else added. The tide had turned. Richard's breathing grew shallow as the rancher gathered the last piece of evidence. He pulled out a stack of photographs, screenshots of forged bylaws with Richard's signature on them, alongside records showing they were filed after the HOA's charter was supposedly finalized. You rewrote rules, the rancher said, illegally, and you used them to threaten, extort, and control this neighborhood. You thought no one would stand up to you, but you were wrong. Richard's voice cracked into a shout. Enough! Guards, remove him! But the guards didn't move. They shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between Richard and the badge on the table. One finally muttered, We're not touching this. That was when the door opened. Two sheriff's deputies stepped inside, boots echoing against the floor. Their presence was quiet but commanding. The rancher had arranged this part carefully, knowing Richard's reaction would trap him further. Richard Calloway, one deputy asked firmly. You're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, forgery, and multiple counts of harassment. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Richard stumbled backward, his face pale now, sweat beading at his temples. No, you can't. This is a mistake, he stammered, his words tripping over each other. The deputies moved forward, quick and efficient. Richard tried to bolt, but one caught his arm, twisting it behind his back. The other snapped cuffs around his wrists. The sound of the metal locking shut echoed louder than any gavel. The rancher stood silently as Richard was hauled toward the door, his protests turning into pitiful pleas. I built this neighborhood. You can't do this to me. I'm the president. But the neighbors only watched, their expressions a mixture of relief and vindication. For the first time in years, they weren't afraid. As Richard was dragged out, one of the men spoke up, his voice carrying through the silence. Not anymore. When the door finally closed behind him, the rancher gathered his papers. The neighbors approached, one by one, thanking him, shaking his hand, some even clapping him on the back. Elias stood by his side, quiet but proud. The rancher looked around the room, at the men who had once been divided and afraid, now united. This community doesn't need fear to survive, he said. It needs trust. And it's time you had that again. There were nods all around, voices agreeing. Some spoke of rebuilding, others of abolishing the HOA altogether. But one thing was certain, Richard's reign was finished. By the next week, his accounts were frozen, his properties seized, his reputation in ruins. The HOA dissolved under legal pressure, its charter dismantled piece by piece. The neighborhood, once suffocated by rules and fear, finally breathed free. The rancher returned to his land, the sun setting warm over the fields. Elias walked beside him, silent for a moment before saying softly, "Feels different now, doesn't it?" The rancher nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "It feels right." They reached the barn, the animals calm, the air filled with the quiet peace of a place finally safe. Justice had been served, not just for Elias, but for every man in that neighborhood. And as the rancher looked out over his land, he knew one thing with certainty. Richard had thought he was untouchable. But arrogance always leaves a man blind, and this time it had left him in shackles. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of abuse of authority, harassment, and the strategic triumph over injustice. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of standing up for your rights and the dramatic consequences of underestimating a person's true power.